Hello and welcome to the first episode of the UK CIF Leadership Podcast COP26 series. This is set to be an excellent few weeks with 30,000 people descending on Glasgow, including dozens of world leaders, all hoping to progress the fight against climate change through regulatory announcements, negotiations and target setting. It's Sally here and I'm joined by James and Oscar to discuss what we here at UK CIF see happening at the conference, what we hope will come out of it. So thanks for tuning in.
Hello, it's James and Sally here to let you all know about our podcast sponsor.
This COP26 series of the UK CIF Leadership Podcast is sponsored by Lion Trust. We're delighted to have them involved. Lion Trust is a specialist fund management company that was founded in 1995.
And as of July 2021, they had £34 billion in assets under management. Their aim is to have a positive impact on their investors, stakeholders, and society.
We're so pleased to have them on board for this series. Without the support of our partners, the podcast would not be able to happen.
So, without further interruption, let's get on with the episode.
So to start, it might be worth discussing what COP26 is and how it works. James, I know you've been to some COPs in the past, so it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Well, I guess, COP, let's go back to basics. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. This is the 26th Conference of the Parties. And those parties are the countries, which is almost every country in the world, that have signed up to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which is effectively is the name of an organization now, a UN body, which runs the COP. It is responsible for setting the agendas, for making things happen. And of course, this is the, fifth COP since the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was COP21. We're now on COP26. Usually they're held every year. Of course, we've missed a year because of the pandemic. What happens at COP? Well, generally, it's almost a game of two halves. There's the bit that you don't see, which is actually where all the action happens. That's where the negotiators come from every country around the world, convened by the UN under the presidency of a specific country that's chosen for the task. In this case, the presidency is the UK, in partnership with Italy, and they put forward a bid jointly with Italy. I think that was a bit of a diplomatic fudge because Italy and the UK were both applying for it, and so it was agreed that they would both kind of co-host it, I suppose, but really the UK is doing the presidency. And that's why you currently hear Alok Sharma being called the COP president designate, because he's actually technically not yet the COP president. That doesn't actually happen until the very first item of business at the COP. And then something that I think we are forgetting about is we actually remain the president. We, the UK, remain the presidency of the COP for a whole year until the next COP. And one of the other items of business at this COP is to decide where the next COP will be. And my understanding is Egypt is in the running to be the next host of the COP. So at some point, presumably next year, we will pass the baton on as presidency to Egypt, albeit, of course, that as president designate, that's when you have the most sway and leverage. You go, as Alok Sharma's done, you travel the world speaking to governments and convincing them to sign up to things, convincing them to work. So that's the kind of formal part of the COP business. It's negotiating. It's behind closed doors. It's all done, late into the evening. It's not very visible. And then one hopes that at the end, the sausage factory, if you like, has kind of swung into action, and there's some sort of agreement that comes out at the end of it. Already, we've heard that the hoped for agreement of $100 billion a year of aid from rich countries to poor countries is not going to be met. There's been some press over the last week saying that that's unlikely to happen, which is, of course, a massive shame, and actually was one of the key things that I think many developing countries have been really hoping for as an expression of goodwill from rich world nations, who, of course, are actually, if you look at where the emissions have come from that are currently in the atmosphere, most of them have come from rich world countries like the UK, Europe, and America. And then, of course, that brings on to the other half of what is a COP, which is this big global jamboree. And so when I worked internationally, I did a lot of work on international climate finance. I would present at COPs on issues particularly related to cities. And we do have a podcast coming up in this series on cities, because there is a cities and urban day. And so I used to go around different COPs presenting on some of the challenges cities were facing, and as part of the side event schedule. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of side events, loads and loads of what are called observer organizations who get passes to COPs to go and sort of see what's going on, participate in these events. And what I loved about COPs is that all the people that I wanted to speak to in the course of the year were actually all there together. It was an amazing meeting place for people working on climate change, climate finance, and different policies related to climate change over the course of the year. So yeah, it was a fantastic gathering point. Now, of course, for a UK-focused organisation like UK CIF, would we be going to a COP if it weren't in the UK? Probably not. It's not really the area that we are trying to influence, but it is being held in the UK. We want to drive forward UK leadership on sustainable finance. And so we are really there to try and push the UK government to drive forward, to drive further, to push for more agreement, and I suppose to highlight and show that that from the UK sustainable finance industry is really willing and keen to play its part and sees this global challenge to reach net zero as something that UK financial services can and should be having a leading role in. So yeah, looking forward to the weeks ahead.
Thanks, James. Oscar, looking back, what have we seen in the run-up to COP26? I know the budget was announced on Wednesday, which had you quite busy for a couple of days, and the announcement of the net zero roadmap. What are the standout points?
Indeed, Sally, there's been a huge amount to keep the UK CIF team and myself very busy. Lots of headline measures, which will have huge implications, really, for the sustainable finance sector and wider financial services, in the years and if not the decades to come. So I suppose starting back, we had the UK government's greening finance roadmap. A lot of this built on the Chancellor's Mansion House speech from July this year, which announced the Sustainability Disclosure Requirements Regime, otherwise known as SDR. So really, SDR was the main focus of this greening finance roadmap recently published. The SDR framework is hugely ambitious. It signals a slightly different approach from the European Union. It aims to bring together firms' disclosures against a number of things, including global standards, such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, standards that will be considered by the IFRS, International Sustainability Standards Board, and also reporting against the UK's green taxonomy. So it's a sort of catch-all, really, for all financial services and indeed corporates disclosures on sustainability. And the real aim of this regime is to make sure that this information on sustainability is really passed across the investment chain, including from corporates to investors. So essentially, the aim is to have much greater clarity on this information so that investors can be better informed in their capital allocation and investment decisions and actually drive financial flows towards a net zero future. So the Green Finance Roadmap, it's huge. We continue to digest it here at UK CIF along with our members, and we're getting questions almost daily on this roadmap and its implications for the sector. So that's the Greening Finance Roadmap. I suppose the second big publication announced by the government in run-up to COP was the Net Zero Strategy, a much kind of broader framework for how the UK envisaged its plans for decarbonising the economy in future. It sets out a number of targets for how the UK would achieve its 6 carbon budget. This sets out the emissions that the UK would achieve from the period 2033 to 2037, which are actually enshrined in UK legislation. It sets out a lot of the envisaged emissions reduction pathways for pretty much all sectors of the economy we see in the strategy. So from the kind of power sector to offshore oil and gas, to heating and buildings and transport as well as alongside other key sectors. Interestingly, it seems like the envisaged carbon reduction pathways are broadly in line with what the Climate Change Committee and its chief executive, Chris Stark, has broadly recommended. So that's hugely positive. I suppose, though, the view of many of our members and UK CIF is that actually the investments required to meet these emissions reduction pathways perhaps is a little bit off track, we think. There are huge investments that are required both on the public spending side and also on the private finance side, and there seems to be gaps in both of those areas. And this is actually leads me on to the third major sort of policy announcement in the run-up to COP around the spending review and budget. This was really expected for many of us in the industry, expected to really offer a bit more clarity on how the investment gaps would be would be fulfilled for us to reach our net zero ambitions. And it seems like from this, there's still perhaps arguably a lack of clarity on the investment that we require to meet our net zero ambitions. On surface level, it appears like a lot of the spending commitments outlined in the government's budget and spending review are actually recycled from previous announcements, such as those coming from the net zero strategy and other sectoral strategies announced by the government over the summer, including for transport. So we'll need to continue taking a fine tooth, I suppose, Sally, through the spending review and budget to see what is actually new spending commitments and how we're actually going to reach how is the public spending going to help the UK reach a net zero future? So all in all, very positive steps in all three of these documents, but still clearly more work to be done.
And what are the big announcements that we're hoping for? Obviously, a lot's been announced in the run-up, as you've just covered, but what are we hoping will be announced in the next 2 weeks?
So I think, one of the most exciting things that COP has driven this year is really big engagement from corporates, whether that's financial services firms or whether it's kind of companies in the wider real economy. And those announcements have all been related to net zero and achieving net zero. And so I think one of the key things that I think will come out as a success from the Glasgow COP is that so much of the real economy and the financial service industry started making these really big commitments to net zero. So we're seeing pension funds committed to net zero. We're seeing asset managers, banks, and others, even sort of service providers starting to looking to the net zero commitments. And they're all kind of now joining together under this umbrella of the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, as it's being called. I think Mark Carney is leading that. And that is designed to really kind of get people working together on some of the huge challenges that are needed. And of course, UK CIF plays a role. We're supporting our members to figure out what some of the answers to these are. So we've seen a lot of members that have now made net zero commitments, which is obviously really exciting to see, and really important and impressive. I think, of course, the next step for this is to figure out, well, how do you take a net zero commitment and turn it into reality? Of course, the net zero commitments generally run to 2050. And so it can't be a case of, well, we've made our net zero commitment today, we can forget about this until 2040, in which case our successor in, as chief executive or whatever is going to have to worry about this very deeply. It's got to be a case of, well, no, hang on, what is the plan year by year so that we can show that we're making the changes that we need to do now, that will make life a lot easier for us by the time we hit 2040 and 2050. And of course, net zero does ultimately mean getting to zero, and we think that there probably is, I guess at the moment, a bit of an over reliance on the net half of net zero, and a feeling that people can offset their way to success in this. And the reality, of course, is that as we get closer to 2050, I think the availability of offsets is going to be quite challenged. I think we've got a podcast coming up tomorrow, I think, where we're going to talk about some of the challenges around the net part of net zero. So do tune in for that one. But I think realistically, that's been one of the great announcements or great expectations of COP, is how many different companies have made that commitment. Also, we've seen countries make net zero commitments as well over the last year or two. I think the most recent one was Saudi Arabia making a net zero commitment, which was pretty unexpected, and I think is going to be certainly a challenge to see how they get there. Australia has made recently a net zero commitment as well, albeit that's been somewhat mocked because it doesn't suggest any reduction in fossil fuel use at all. And so one wonders how that's actually going to work, whether they're thinking it's more about net than zero. Again, we don't necessarily think that that's going to be a realistic and viable pathway. So, and that links back then to the wider consideration about transition plans. The roadmap that Oscar was just talking about does mention, has a kind of page dedicated to transition plans at this point, suggesting that net zero transition plans that are aligned to the government's net zero pathway, which, if you remember, is completely net zero by 2050, that's in law, but actually also in law is a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035. That, I think, is actually the much tougher part to do. I guess it does mean that we'll be focusing on the low-hanging fruit to begin with, and then we've got a good few years to focus on the much more harder to abate sectors, which of course we have to do. That's the way around that it has to work, and we've got to work doubly hard now to get those easy things done, which are actually, we think they're easy. We call them the easy things, but they're not easy. It's transport, it's heating, and other things. The harder things are obviously aviation, concrete, steel making. Those currently don't actually have clear sector pathways to get to net zero, but nevertheless. The government wants to see corporates and, by extension, investors starting to disclose their transition plans. I think that will be on a comply or explain basis. But I think there's also a scenario where the government actually puts more flesh on the bones of that in an announcement at COP. Over the next 2 weeks, and let's see what they say, because I think that's going to be a really interesting one, and actually an area where there's quite a lot of different views across the financial services industry, and something that we're actively working with members to understand exactly what range of views there are. But I think the key thing for us, there's two key things. First of all, when we think about net zero and Paris alignment, we have to think about, it's not just about, do we hit zero emissions on, I suppose, the 1st of January 2050? It's actually also about the area under the curve. We can't just keep on emitting at the level we're currently emitting, but hope that we hit to zero by 2050, because it's about the amount of carbon dioxide that can be released into the atmosphere over that period of time. And so we've got to be thinking this is not just about a fixed deadline years into the future where we're going to be zero, but it's got to be about cutting that now. And then it's also about what can each of us do, how can each of us play that role to get there, and how can therefore decision making around net zero flow through the DNA of different companies, whether that's in the real economy or whether it's in financial services. This cannot just be something that the chief executive announces and then no one ever thinks about again for the next 10 years. This has got to be something that starts filtering through every layer of decision making, and that, to be honest, was one of the disappointments with the Chancellor's budget last week. There was barely a mention of climate change throughout the budget speech. And the reality is every decision that government is taking, likewise with every decision that corporates are taking, needs to be passed through that net zero lens if we're to succeed in this endeavor. And I don't yet see the evidence that that's happening at scale across government. And if it's not happening in government, I guess the response from the corporate sector is, well, why should we be doing it if government's not prepared to do it itself? And I think that's a really key question that we need to start tackling.
Thanks, James. And what are we hoping will come after COP, especially as you mentioned, James, with the year of the UK's continued G7 presidency?
I think the next year is going to be really interesting, and just. I think what's happening now is this growth in urgency, this growth in expectation of action, and the COVID recovery should hopefully be, fingers crossed, well underway. The global economy recovering, the hope of building back better either being realized or dashed, perhaps, as we look forward to 2022. And I think that's one of the key challenges is what is the UK government going to use its presidency to do? Now, clearly, the COP itself is the key point for the UK's presidency, and the rest of it is about the focus on the next president. But what we do know is that there is a stock take of the finance components for COP27, which is 2022's COP. And so over the next year or so, we can start thinking about, well, what is our contribution to that stock take? What is our thinking around where that moves to? And so, for example, how do we define what a net zero financial services industry looks like? How do we define what financial services needs to do to be aligned and compliant with the Paris Agreement, and to therefore contribute to that stock take, which happens next year? I think these are some pretty big questions that don't really yet have answers. There's a lot of people calling for big commitments around net zero financial services. We think that the step before that is actually to start understanding, well, what does that really look like in practice? How do we start getting a kind of consensus of the industry around that? And then, of course, building towards that. What is the roadmap to achieving that? So over the course of next year, the government is committed to publishing a new financial services net zero strategy, which will be much more than the roadmap published last week or the week before. It will be the kind of real strategy, sector strategy for financial services and how it gets there. And that will complement sector strategies that have already been published around transport and energy. And so I think, financial services is next on the list. And of course, for UK CIF, we're going to play a really key role in supporting that work and helping figure out how we get there.
I think another area where attention will quickly turn to, Sally, is on biodiversity and natural capital. There is growing awareness, among those of us in the industry, policymakers, regulators, of the need to address biodiversity-related risks and opportunities. And it's great to see this rise up the agenda. And it's something that at UK CIF, we're prioritising a lot of our kind of policy work and activity day to day. Of course, following COP26, we've then got COP15 taking place in Kunming, China. I think it is in April. We've had part one of that take place already. But this is the main, hopefully in-person summit to really agree a new framework for biodiversity going forward. This will aim to replace the Aichi agreement targets that were agreed a decade or so ago, to really look to combat and reverse nature loss and biodiversity degradation. It's an area where UK CIF has been very active in. We wrote a letter to Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, very recently, calling on the UK to show renewed global leadership on this issue. And of course, ahead of the summit in Kunming, China early next year, and during the UK's COP26 presidency, which, as James said earlier, is actually continuing post Glasgow in November. This is an ideal opportunity for the UK to take a series of steps to show that it is serious about addressing these issues and encouraging others to do the same. So in our letter, we called on the UK government to take a series of steps during its COP26 presidency. This included the UK playing an active leadership role in the adoption of TNFD. This is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, a very similar disclosure framework to account for nature-related risks and opportunities based on the success of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. In our letter, we call on the UK to encourage a broader group of countries beyond the G7, such as developing nations and the G20, to engage with and support the work of TNFD. We also call for the UK to play an active role in ensuring that financial flows can be consistent with a net nature positive future, and have this ambition reflected in the upcoming UN Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that will be hopefully agreed at the summit in China early next year. We'd also like policymakers to provide a clearer picture on the potential policy and transition risks that the sector could face when it comes to biodiversity, to help inform investors' investment decisions. And we'll also like to see a little more clarity from the government on how biodiversity and nature might be incorporated in the sustainability disclosure requirements regime that James and I spoke about a little while before. A few other things that we mentioned in our letter, Sally, to the Chancellor is around the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. Clearly a hugely seminal piece of work, but perhaps for some of our sector, it maybe lacked a bit of the crunchy what next and some of the policy recommendations for the sector and businesses to then adopt and commit to. So we'd like government to commit to a formal process to consider the implementation of the Dasgupta review's findings and see how we can take this forward during the UK's presidency of COP26. And finally, we had an ask of the government to commit the National Infrastructure Bank to have a new mandate to consider natural capital and deliver net positive biodiversity gains in infrastructure projects financed by the National Infrastructure Bank, for it to sit very nicely alongside its levelling up agenda and mandate on net zero. So those are some of our initial thoughts on kind of biodiversity. And it's certainly an area that, if government isn't turning its attention to, we will certainly be continue to turn our attention to in the months ahead of the summit in China early next year.
And that's part of our kind of wider consideration, I guess, of thinking about planetary boundaries as being something where we need to position our thinking. we are obviously breaching planetary boundaries when it comes to carbon emissions. That's why we're seeing global temperature rise. But we're also breaching a lot of other planetary boundaries, water pollution, air quality, soil health, deforestation, and others. And where we're not necessarily breaching them, we're coming very close to what are regarded as some of the key tipping points that might have a tremendously negative impact on the world as we know it and on humanity. And I think that is where we need to start addressing our thinking. Of course, we can't just copy and paste ways of working for climate change to nature. We've got to think very carefully about these things, not least where the data is going to come from, how that's going to work, and how people are going to make disclosures and decisions based and prioritize, I suppose, decisions based on these things. So, lots to think about, and lots to do over the coming years.
I think we're just about at the end of our time, but this has been a really helpful overview. I hope our audience has enjoyed it. Thanks so much, both. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. James and I will actually be at COP26 this week, so and next week. I think James is still up there for next week. So if you do see us around, come and say hi. A big thank you to our sponsor, Lion Trust, for helping us make this all possible. And don't forget to like, subscribe, tune in to all of our other COP26 episodes. You can find us on Twitter, also at UKSIF. Speak soon.